Welcome to the Jeff and Alex podcast. I am Jeff Hillemeyer, and with my friend Alex Gonzalez, we explore topics that help you be your best self. And we also get to chat with some great guests. So join us now on the Jeff and Alex podcast.
Hello and welcome, everybody. Welcome to this world where Jeff Hillemeyer and I are going to just talk to you. So Jeff, and of course, I'm Alex Gonzalez, and next on the screen next to me here is Jeff. How are you doing, Jeff?
I'm good. How's it going this morning?
Okay. So, of course, people could be watching this whenever, but I guess we're here on a beautiful Saturday morning.
Yeah, I can see the sun coming in your place. I'm in like a little quarantined off tiny little closet that I've stationed to be away from the family while I get work done.
And what's funny, because talking about here in Atlanta where we're at, I always joke to Jeff, to you, Jeff, about how you never go OTP, outside the perimeter, for those who might be watching who don't know what that is, and and always trying to get Jeff to at least visit, somewhere up here. And he reminds me the other day that he's more OTP than I am now.
I'm O or TP than you. Yeah.
So it takes a pandemic for you to finally go OTP, is what you're saying.
That's right. I escaped to the wilderness an hour north of Atlanta.
Well, good. Well, I'm looking forward to this. If you're watching, you click, thank you. It's funny, as Jeff and I were thinking about doing something together. We've talked about doing something together for a while. And first said, well, let's just record the conversations we had. And of course, now, as soon as we start recording, we'll probably don't know what to say, but we'll work through it. But one of the things, Jeff, that we've just talked about the other day, which I think would be a great thing to kind of lean into. There's so many topics we could explore, and so many things, particularly on leadership and being a leader, being innovative, being creative, and frankly, we could even talk about other stuff, about family and favorite TV shows or whatever. But kind of what so much started with, you and I met, I believe, through the marketing roundtable, which is mainly corporate CMOs on it. But there's this aspect around, for me, and then as I got to know you, learning through you, about this connectivity between entrepreneurism and corporate. Mm-hmm. And so much so as I'm almost forget that you and I come from, I come from this 20 plus years of corporate life, and then coming out of it with this belief that there's ways to be more disruptive and innovative even in a corporate environment. And then you come from an entrepreneurial perspective, believing that there's an element coming into corporate. So this would be great to kind of explore that today, and because in that perspective. And so, Jeff, maybe starting out. And by the way, this is not a plug, but I do have my kind of Jeff's book here, which really,
thank you.
And he didn't pay me for that, so actually I don't know what my rate is for this, but Jeff, in all seriousness, though, you're always, when I think about an entrepreneur to talk to, I think about you, but you really have this perspective about entrepreneurism in a corporate perspective. So let's talk about, maybe we'll start talking there. How do you think about that?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think the reason that I have focused on that, the corporate side of entrepreneurship, if there is such a thing, is because my clients have always been corporations. And so I've built digital agencies for the last 20 years and worked with Coke and Home Depot and Equifax when you were there. Mm-hmm. And so, what I kept seeing was these outliers of people within corporations that still acted entrepreneurially. And not because they had been a founder of a company, but because it was a mindset, right?
Right.
But most, by and large, corporations have a really hard time innovating. And the best they can typically do is acquire startups that will help them be a little more forward thinking. But even then, they almost always ruin that startup that they acquire. And so meeting people like yourself, we know some other people that come from more of a corporate background, but have that entrepreneurial mindset, led me to believe that there is hope, that it's definitely more a mindset than it is you have to be a startup, and that it's impossible with a large corporation.
Yeah, no, and it's so funny because I think you're on to kind of the secret to all this, which as you start looking at being innovative and all that, it's really comes back to that person. And I think people always ask me, it's like, can corporations be innovative? Like, absolutely, but it's really the people within that have to start, and particularly leaders at a specific level. So here's a kind of maybe interesting question, because I've got asked this before a lot. So I have a perspective on this. So one that would be good to start maybe with yours is as well. But is entrepreneurism and innovation the same thing?
Right. Yeah.
Being,
No, I don't.
or maybe it is being an entrepreneur and being innovative. So by definition, some people would believe that if you're an entrepreneur, that means you're innovative. And I have a thought on this, and that journey it went on. But want to hear, well, how do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I definitely don't think that, and I think it's because I come from like I learned about entrepreneurship from my father growing up. He had a vending company, and
Mm,
to my knowledge, look, great sales guy, knows the industry well. I don't know that he's ever done anything innovative in that business. He just worked hard, controlled his own destiny. I know he made tough decisions. I know he had to change a little bit with his business, but innovative, I'm not so sure. So I definitely see a difference there. And I also see a difference between the startup founder versus the um, like I would call myself an entrepreneur more than a startup founder. The
mm,
business I've created isn't as much a startup as it's a small business. However, I think to be very successful at entrepreneurship, you have to be able to be innovative. And I would flip it and say to be innovative, there has to really be innovative in whatever you're doing. You have to be entrepreneurial in some sense, meaning you see a wall, you don't think it's a roadblock. It's simply a stepping stone. You have to be able to push yourself to go over challenges and not just throw your hands up, which is impossible if you're trying to be innovative. So that's sort of how I see
right.
those two worlds blending.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. I would say that I think being and kind of going back to kind of where I started. There's a point I was in corporate, and then decided to kind of take a launching point. And I said, well, the startup thing that's the secret to innovation. They've got it figured out because, of course, you see all the headlines, whether it's the launch of whatever, Uber, uh, TikTok, whatever it is, and it's all the headlines. But I think, or at least what I always talk to folks about is that there is being entrepreneurism and innovation. There's actually some skill sets in entrepreneurism that's really more about efficiency and focus than just about being innovative. It may have started with an innovative idea,
Mhm.
and part of it, frankly, if you think about how you invest in a startup, it's and in many cases once the idea is set, it's about locking in and executing and execution. Now, I do think that the skill that you can bring into corporations, and I think frankly the irony is, I know there's this whole thing about entrepreneurism and entrepreneurism, and so much. How do you bring more entrepreneurial energy into corporations? And sometimes I say, yeah, it may not just be about the innovative. I think what entrepreneurs and startups bring that's more innovative is they're closer to the customer.
Yeah.
So they understand what's happening maybe than a big corporation. But the nimbleness of, I have only so much capital. So I got to
Mhm.
figure something out pretty quick. I'm a big believer that constraints drive the best innovation. But I do think that also then you got to focus and figure it out. I mean, I think that's one of the strengths of entrepreneurship, more so than we're going to we're going to just think of 25 different ideas that come down to it, which I think this is sometimes a mix up people get between what innovation and
Mhm.
entrepreneurism is. But I do think that dealing with scarcity is an aspect that could come into a corporation.
100%. Yeah. When I see it, when I see a corporation invest in innovation, and they're putting day one, a team of 30 and
Right.
$5 million, it's likely not going to work. It's this weird thing where put two people in a room and give them 3 months to figure something out, or they lose their job and they'll figure something out, right? And that's the difference between an entrepreneur is, to your point, you either innovate or you die. Your business ends. Whereas if Coca-Cola doesn't find a new way to innovate, they're fine. They've got a stable business, and it just makes it really hard to take those risks. I'm curious from your perspective, because I've seen you go from corporate
Hmm.
to both really civic and entrepreneur.
Yeah.
So you've really taken a change, but you've worked at some of the largest companies in the world in your past. How have you seen, looking back, like, are there things that now that you are an entrepreneur and that you say, gosh, I could have done that differently, or that was a roadblock that I could have gotten around, or did you always sort of operate that way?
Yeah, well, I mean, it always has. By the way, in case anybody's wondering, this segment's brought to you by
now,
Dragon
now that I did
Armies.
pay you for.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, with a mug.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I had to buy my own coffee to put in the mug too, but that's
Right.
okay. But no, it's actually interesting. When I look, first of all, I mean, I look back, I mean, and this is part of my career when I was in GE, and that was some of the best. Yeah, I always tell people that's where I got my MBA effectively, because one thing you learn there, back in their heyday of kind of leadership training is there's always something you could do different, always do better. And there's so many times that I look back that, man, there's actually some entrepreneurial aspects I learned there in one of the biggest companies in the world at the time. Obviously, GE has gone through a lot of changes over the last few years. And I had a boss, or actually not my direct boss, but when I was part of the marketing organization, I was very fortunate to be there when Beth Comstock, and you, Jeff, you've heard me say this before, but when people ask what my true north is, it's in terms of where I learned kind of my perspective of leadership and innovation and strategy. It's around Beth Comstock, who was the first female first CMO and first female vice chair of General Electric. And it really was this, there's almost this entrepreneurial energy there, and part of it is that thing with reflection. What would you change is always something you would do different. But specific to your question, though, for me, I always talk about I had corporate ADD, and maybe that's part of being an entrepreneur, or not. Maybe it's completely not, because I was that person who's like, how do we push a boundary, break something, rebuild, do it for something better. More of a provocateur, whether I was running a business or whether I was in a function for it. I wouldn't change that. If anything, if I reflect back, it is so easy and the thing that kind of got me into exploring this whole topic, it is so easy in a large corporate environment to gravitate towards safety.
Yeah.
And unlike an entrepreneur who is looking at a cash running out, when you're an executive or working at a big company, the perception, which by the way, in this environment you're in, it's a perception, because corporations, you could,
Yeah.
things could disappear in a dime much faster than sometimes even in other worlds, but that you're safe. But I think what I've seen a lot is there's sometimes a pull to safety, and how, well, I don't want to implement this idea.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
if I look back, I mean, sure, there's many times where I'm like, I could think specifically when I was running a business, I kind of a really big role. And there's some things that I'm like, wow, I wish, once I was in there and worried about quarterly earnings, you start kind of hedging. There's some parts where I'm like, I should have found that equilibrium. What's the right risk reward balance?
Yeah.
So there's clearly a lot of times I would do that, but I think that's really at the essence of it from a big corporation. I look back, and the thing I always would like to explore with people is, how do you get that kind of that grit and that risk? Which, by the way, we know a lot of entrepreneurs. Not
That's
all
right.
founders have it.
That's right.
So I think this applies to both sides of it. But how do you find that balance of being able to take risk, not being just blind taking risk, but taking that risk and grit? Because that to me is where great innovation occurs. And
Agreed.
it's hard to do in a big company, because I'd say the biggest difference is, as a founder, you might have your investors and those around you, and then it's your belief system to push through. And then corporation, you have a lot of functions and
Yeah.
lawyers and finance people and other operators and people wanting your job and all that might be going against you, and you kind of have to work towards that.
I'm almost through with the Bob Iger
Yeah,
autobiography. I don't know if
yeah.
have you read it yet?
No, I've not. I'm a big fan of what he does. So
It's so amazing. It's so great. And the risks that he took almost immediately when he took the CEO job. I think the first one was the Pixar deal, and I mean, pretty much everybody was against it at the beginning. And then after that, he immediately did Marvel, and then he did
Mm-hmm.
Lucas. I mean, it was like one big bet after another. And I don't know if that's because he was at a point in his career where he was willing to take those risks, but he was definitely betting the farm on those things, and obviously they've been amazing.
And I think, to me, so much a leader or any leader, he clearly had a vision, a purpose and a vision, for the Walt Disney Company, and being this collection of assets and taking the risk and taking the swing. And again, I haven't read the book, or so I don't know if he talks about it. It's probably how he convinced his board, and I'm sure he gets into even his board composition. Do I have visionaries on the board? And then he had some of the best deal makers when he did make the deal. But no, I think what he did. I mean, can you imagine if Walt Disney, and there's obviously suffering, not struggling, but they're definitely feeling the impacts of the current economic environment. But could you imagine if they didn't buy Pixar? Could you imagine if they didn't buy Marvel or Lucasfilms? I mean, those overvalued assets are no more.
I mean, it's unbelievable. The difference of that company versus, say, 15 years before.
Yeah.
I mean,
And
they
some
would
people,
be really,
like to argue about, the Star Wars franchise is not as good now as it was. That's a whole different
yeah.
argument, because I think the checks are still clearing.
Mandalorian. Did you watch Mandalorian?
Oh yeah, that was good.
Super
That
good. I
was
mean,
good.
yeah, they're doing some pretty good things over
The
there.
man, yeah, and I can't wait till they could start filming again,
Yeah.
because they have a lot of stuff planned for it. But Mandalorian was. I still think just on the whole streaming platforms. I mean, I think you're a big Apple Plus fan as well, but what they're doing, the streaming platforms on creativity,
Yeah.
and Apple's a great example too. Could you imagine? I mean, kind of going back to your prior discussion, um, from a leadership perspective, saying we're going to create a studio and content. I mean, that has to come back to vision in terms of what this world is going to look like. Now, you could argue Bob Iger was really the one who started that momentum, and maybe not. But for all these tech companies to say we're going to become studios.
Yeah.
Hey, by the way, Apple Plus is pretty darn good. But
Yeah, the quality's great.
but yeah, but I agree
Well,
with you.
here's an interesting thing from the book. So Iger talks about he built a really good relationship with Steve Jobs,
Yep.
and Disney didn't have one leading up to him becoming CEO. They were really fighting over the Pixar movies and sequels and stuff. It was just not good. And he says in the book that he thinks had Steve not died, that they would have brought Apple and Disney together.
I believe it.
Yeah.
I,
Think about that.
believe it. Could you imagine that combination? It's interesting. Then it comes out of you lead a combination like that, right? But I believe it, and I think those are, if you look at Steve Jobs, and you should probably seen some of the movies or books around him. I mean, there's this visionary drive thing that's hard, and there is a little, people. I was having a conversation with my kids, and they were talking about Steve Jobs and Elon Musk, a lot of these kind of modern day entrepreneurs, and they're like, man, they all seem to be, there seems to be some quirks with them, right? They seem, are they in terms, and there's almost an element at that scale that this exuberance and confidence and a little crazy, and I say that in a good way, not in a mental health way, to just be able to push through. And Steve Jobs, I think, going to that, I mean, think about how much failure he had in his career.
Yeah, unbelievable. Both. Elon Musk. I mean, there was a point, if you read his story, where all three of his businesses they were all on the brink of closing before he
Yeah.
made a few moves and pushed through. Yeah, no, Steve has an epic journey, if you think about it.
And so to that, I think the challenge then becomes for if you're in a big company, or if you're an entrepreneur, but let's say if you take for a corporation, then people say, well, I'm not Steve Jobs, and I'm not Bob Iger, and there's definitely compensation plans that kind of allow them to take great risk. But I think that's the journey you take. What is that vision? What is your purpose? I've had people come to me and say, even in this current environment, when I work with big companies or talk to different people, and they say, well, my company's not innovative enough, and here's the ideas I have. And my retort is always, well, what risk are you taking to make that happen? It doesn't mean try to get yourself fired, But I think it's such an important part, and it's easy to have someone else, your idea, and have someone else run with it. And if it doesn't work, you kind of hide behind the rock. And that's, I think, what makes those leaders so different and more innovative as well too. So
I'll tell you, I know we talk about West Wing, and we're
yeah.
the West Wing. By the way, I just got to we've talked about this, but I watch the West Wing when I'm doing the dishes, which is one of my jobs at the house, and with
So
5
my
children.
question is, are your dishes actually clean then? Because I can't watch. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm pretty good at the dishes. We have a lot of them, right? I mean, like, with 5 children, it's a full load of the dishwasher at least once a day. And so I probably get 20, 25 minutes of watching West Wing a day. Anyways, I'm on the Matt Santos. Josh just
yes.
approached him at his house and said, I want you to run for president. Anyways, what about The Office? Did you watch The Office?
Oh yeah, huge fan of The Office.
So I built SpunLogic. We sold it after 10 years to a private equity firm who created Engage. And so then myself and 2 other agencies came together and formed Engage. We were 250 people. I was 75 people when we came to the table. And after a year of essentially running digital for the broader Engage, for many reasons, but mainly because I didn't feel like I was being entrepreneur. I went to the board and I said, look, I've got, say at that point, 100 people reporting up to me. I no longer want to run digital. There's not enough freedom in there for me to innovate and to be entrepreneurial. And so this was in 2009 or end of 2008. And so I told him, I said, look, I think we need to invest in social and emerging technology that if we don't stay on top of that stuff, we're not going to stay, in line with where the industry goes. And so I said, let me have 1 employee. There was like a back room in our office in Promenade in Midtown. I was like, let me have that little, storage area. Let me have 1 employee. And I'll give all the rest of the employees, they can report to Raj, my former partner at SpunLogic. Anyways, and so they agreed. And so for a year, I almost had my own startup within Engage. I had almost no responsibility from a reporting perspective. I could do what I wanted. I was still on the board, but anyways, reason I bring up The Office is because after about a month of me and this employee being in the back room, someone put up the Michael Scott Paper Company on the door, which was when Michael had his own company within the building.
Right.
But I bring that story up because even I had trouble. I mean, I loved our private equity partners, but there was still a conservativeness. There was no reason for them to take a big risk.
Right.
Because they had a plan and it was a 5-year thing, and then we were going to sell, and you don't want to rock the boat. But even in that scenario, I was like, I'm too restricted. And it ended up being that team I built grew to 25 or 30 people. And then by the time we sold, we were a social agency. So it worked, but I mainly did it because I was like, I got to be able to do my own thing here. Because I was wired that way. There were just too many rules in place, too much reporting, too much spreadsheets. And so I think it even in a small 250 people is not a big company. Even a small company can have those restrictions if the setting is not right.
Yeah, and I think you bring up something too in terms of kind of where your head was, which I found during my career, and perhaps that's why our paths have crossed, and we always keep it connected no matter what. And I've seen it around, kind of as a lot of people we know, mutual acquaintances we know. I do believe there's a personality around finding the new, what's the new, and that's okay. And I think companies need that. I think some companies may not be ready for it. And sometimes I think there's some people that say, I want to do this for this company. And I'm like, this is where I'm like, you got to know the stuff about the market. I mean, if they're, well, maybe part of survival is reinventing, but there's certain times when it's right. And by the way, sometimes those should not be forever jobs either.
Yeah, right.
And, and traditionally in big companies, it's like the chief strategy officer, chief innovation officer, sometimes the chief marketing officer. And, and I've had many conversations and still do to say, sometimes you hit this point where you made this monumental change, and then now the company's kind of absorbing it and kind of operationalizing it. That may or may not be the right time from a career perspective
Right.
for that executive to stay there. Now, again, the norms, which is changing, but definitely, our parents, when it came from a norm where you stay in your company for forever.
That's right.
Of course, that's evolving. But I think that's important too, is that for if you're, and this is why I like the kind of, I'm always, when you talk about Bob Iger and all of them, I love, kind of tracking creative industries, but just media in general. But if you think about creatives, I mean, how they move from project to project to project. We just talked about West Wing, and, Aaron Sorkin, for those watching, I mean, West Wing actually has their own podcast called West Wing Weekly. Which covers it, and it's great. But Aaron Sorkin is this amazing writer that did Few Good Men, did many other things. After 4 years, at the peak of the show, he left. Mm-hmm. And you could say, oh, it's about creative differences. It could be a whole, and I think you hear about a lot of different things that go on. But sometimes it's just time, and that's okay. Yeah. And what I love is when you see someone to say, I'm just making up companies, and this is not reflect anything happening real anywhere. But if you're at a bank and you've done your thing, imagine if you take your talents to an airline, or you take it to someplace else. And that's, I think, what makes this, these people who lead, whether it's as a general manager or whether it's in a functional role, I think of them as these creatives who sometimes go from here, this project, to the next project, make change, own the change. So I'm not saying, drop an idea and leave. Yeah. And then kind of, explore something else. And I think, for me, it's just this whole thing where if I'm not doing that, I'll just go. I mean, I'll get stagnant.
I think that's one of the problems I see with entrepreneurs. They get bored a little bit. Their business is 2, 3, 4 years old, and they start to go, I need change. But what the business really needs at that point is stability, and it needs to follow the plan, right? And so what I also fell into, it wasn't by design, but I've realized that it's been the key to my mental health over the last several years, is that Dragon Army is 7 years old, and probably 5 years ago I started 48 and 48, which is a nonprofit, and then last year I started Ripples of Hope, which is a nonprofit. And what's happened is those have allowed me to scratch that itch, that innovative, that entrepreneurial, whatever it is, itch, and be involved in building something while letting Dragon Army continue to grow and be a stable, solid business. But if I didn't have those things, I bet I'd be tinkering all the time. I'd be, let's try this and let's shift now. It's been 3 months. And really, sometimes a business just needs a year to play out the plan.
Right.
But I see a lot of entrepreneurs are constantly like, oh, we tried that for 3 weeks and it didn't work, because they have that mindset. And that's also why a lot of true entrepreneurs, they outgrow their company, because you just need someone to come in and be able to take it and run it without that constant chaos that can come. So I see that. I also think the risk reward is very different for people in corporations, because take GE. You could have an innovative idea for a $10 million business unit. That's not going to move the needle at all. So if you're successful, fine, great, it's a rounding error. But if you fail at it, then that's a huge mark against you, and it's leverage for the internal politics for people to push you down, to step above you. So it's an interesting dichotomy of risk reward within those big
and this is where leadership, and this is where it's kind of system-wide innovative leadership becomes important, and making sure there's room for that to occur, because it is healthy for a multi-billion-dollar company to take a risk that may only have a $10 million shift of the needle, because then the strength of a corporation is, if it then really works and you could get buy-in, the scale of it is, second to none, right? To get the distribution platforms, whatever. But you got to have that room to maneuver where that quote unquote failure within a contained environment is okay. Yeah. And that comes not even to the person leading the projects. And look, we're here in Atlanta, we have like 40 corporate innovation centers, and they range from, R&D kind of engineering driven centers to really kind of culturally driven, how do we drive, innovation process within companies. So it's all over the place. But you see all these different variations of how people are creating space to innovate that's safe. So I think so much of that comes to the leaders in terms of how do we do that. Now, is that entrepreneurism within a company? I don't know. I mean, I know it's innovation. Perhaps that is. And I don't know. What do you think? Because I know there's a big thing around intrapreneurism, and there's all these terms being used to it. But to me, it's about being an innovative leader. And and I think that's for you. You've gotten a lot of requests from companies about, how do we become more like you, Jeff, within my company? And that's what had led to your first book, right?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. No, what's been interesting for me with the first book, so the 5-day turnaround, I wrote it to help leaders that aren't entrepreneurs to embrace the mindset of an entrepreneur. Um, I look at it a little bit more of what are the building blocks of a successful startup. And there are things like focus. You mentioned that earlier. There are things like having a purpose. I use a format: purpose, vision, tenets, and values. But do you have structure? Do you have rigor? Do you measure everything you do to make sure that it's making a difference? And part of my pitch to corporations is allow business units or departments to act more entrepreneurially. Doesn't mean that they have to um, specifically be innovative. But if the marketing department has its own sort of rallying cry, has focus, it's going to outperform a marketing organization that doesn't. And so I think you can look at it team by team, department by department, but I definitely think it's a mindset, and I think it can be learned. I think it's something I've seen it work. So I've done some purpose, vision, tenets, and values workshops with some of the larger corporations in Atlanta, and they're really embracing it. They're really seeing that they can move faster and get more done. And at the very least, it energizes everybody because it makes you feel. You remember the story about Steve Jobs when he was doing the Macintosh?
Yeah.
And the flag.
Oh yeah.
So he basically within Apple created the Macintosh team, and look, it probably divisive, and Steve was a bit of an asshole, so there's that. But he put up a big pirate flag on the building that the Macintosh team was in to give them their own sense of identity and to make them feel special within the walls of Apple.
Right.
And I think that kind of thing makes a difference. Having having a branded shirt for your team, these things just bond people together, and it allows that entrepreneurial thinking and mindset to happen.
Which, by the way, I think crosses everything. I mean, I think with so much success of civic organizations like the Metro Atlanta Chamber, I mean, it's been being very purposeful. It's not just a functional, but there's purpose to drive a region. You see it, in other civic organizations around town, but definitely within companies. And that's one thing that I think, you talk quite a bit about is on purpose. And I believe, in fact, I have a post I'm about to come out specifically talking about purpose and the importance, because whether you call it purpose or it's vision, that rallying cry, I 100% agree with you, is so important. And what I'm writing about right now is two leaders here that you and I both know. Actually, you asked at a Disruptor Studio, Kat Cole, like, what's her purpose? And so she has this personal purpose, and in terms of helping make other people do more than they knew they could realize.
Right.
And so it drives, and you see it in everything she does, whether it's within her company, whether it's within her social work, whatever it is. And then the other aspect that I'm writing about is about Ben Chestnut, who talks. In fact, he may have even talked about a flag too. But that with MailChimp, this broader purpose around small business and how they rally around it, and you see it, and it's so. And to me, when there's a leader that does that, it's so clear that even if someone disagrees on what someone's doing, you could still say, you know what, but they're still on purpose.
Yeah, right.
Even if you don't believe it, you're still on purpose.
That's right.
And it's the ultimate segment. People talk about in marketing, all that segmentation and focus and insight. To me, purpose is a way not just to rally, but it's to focus and take away a lot of debate. And so I know that's a big tenet that you preach. So I 100% agree with that as well too.
You meant you promoted my book earlier, so I'm going to promote the Disruptor Studio. So we'll put in the show notes, we'll put the links to it. But for anyone watching, I think the interviews that you've done with people like Kat and Ben are phenomenal. And it really, that's why I go back to like your ability to be corporate, to be innovative, to be entrepreneurial, to be civic, purpose driven, because you're able to, in those interviews, you've been able to pull out of them the deeper reasons they're doing what they're doing. And I think
Yeah.
I just find that so inspirational to hear these leaders talk about that. So
And by the way, when you talk about an entrepreneurial person in a corporate environment, since we just mentioned Kat, I mean, she's a great example. She's, effectively the number 2 executive at one of the largest, you know, restaurant brand companies, definitely in the country. And if you, I think if you put her in an entrepreneurial environment, showcase whatever, she'd fit right in just as well as she does corporate. But she does talk about that tension, and there's definitely some conversations that we had during that interview, and we'll probably explore more with her as well too, is about that tension that it creates. But it's that look, Jeff, you've talked about taking risk. I think so much of this comes back to how much inner risk people are willing to take and tolerate, and that's really at the heart of it. And going back to kind of my true north, or Beth Comstock, she mentioned once that we were at West Point, and this this, of course, military academy, talking about leadership. We're here, why are we doing here? We're a bunch of marketers. And really what it came down to was, really that we're here because we're change leaders. This is about change, this is about leadership. And she kind of further went on at one point and said, that feeling you get in your stomach when you're about to do something that makes you want to throw up, that means you're onto something. That means you're really going in the right direction if you're driving change, driving leadership. So I think that's a common trait with all these leaders too. They just don't show it all the time, but they're about ready to, puke.
Well, yeah. And what's interesting is I think it's really interesting that people like Beth can get to that point, because for myself, for Ben, who were entrepreneurs early, I didn't realize it, but for the first 5 or 6 years, I started my first company in college. So I was 21. I, you know, I risked everything. I didn't have a lot to risk, but I racked up over $100,000 in credit card debt. I had, no money to my name. Uh, I got married, and I was losing more money than my wife's, job was bringing in. We moved in with my mom year 2 and had to live there. And that kind of like, I was betting everything on it, made it where that's just normal for me now. It's fine. I'm fine with the risk. I'm comfortable with it. But it's always interesting to me how people who didn't come from that can take bigger risks. I find it very amazing when someone who's 30 or 35 starts a new company, because at that point you have a lot to lose and you're not used to that kind of pressure. So that's really admirable to me when people can do that, either within corporations or later in life entrepreneurship, because it's if it's not something you grew up with, it's hard to build up.
I do think, though, it is interesting to explore backgrounds, because it is easy to also, so there's this presumption, especially especially on the corporate side, you talk to somebody in terms of where they're at, and obviously they're in a position of where their wealth or capital, whatever, is so different. But it's always interesting when you hear with stories around kind of their genesis, and I think there is sometimes some commonality around that. I mean, I know for me, I mean, I came from from nothing. I mean, so as you mentioned, that just meant, kind of some traits here, but it was like, just scraping by on credit cards to get through college, and I grew up where, we're like constantly moving different apartments because we couldn't afford the rent and all that. And then coming out on the other side in college, pushing through it, and, just trying to build a foundation to move forward. But I do believe that does build grit. And I do. And sometimes you hear about some companies that kind of look for that, grit. And that's really, and by the way, it doesn't matter your background, as there's just something within you that kind of comes to that. But I do think it's interesting, if you've seen risk, if you've seen what it could be to not have, or whatever it is, does that kind of create some more drive or not? Or does it create more fear? And then that's where I think there
Yeah.
could be, or does that fear drive you? And I don't know. This is where I think it's so different depending on the individual, what that does. But it's interesting you mentioned that because, I think you probably needed to live that. Which goes to this is not even about failure, because what you went through was not failure, but living through certain experiences really are building blocks that allow you to do what you do and maneuver later on as well, too.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that's the case.
So, look, Jeff, I think we could go on and I think our idea is to go on for hours and hours about this, but just maybe in modularized segments too. And one thing, if for anyone who's watching or listening, obviously engage with Jeff and I on our social media platforms. And if you're watching this, most likely you've engaged on at least one of ours. So and also make comments too in terms of things you'd like us to talk about as well too. And look, we'll talk about. We're definitely going to keep talking about leadership. We're going to talk about being innovative. We're going to talk about what does it mean being creative. We hope to have some people that we could talk to about this stuff. And really, look, we're right now being creatives in our own entrepreneurial journey right here in terms of trying to shape what the heck this thing is. And so always welcome your input and we'll evolve. So Jeff, any thoughts here as we try to, or anything you'd like to share as we go to wrap up here?
No, I'm just looking forward to the next one. There's lots of, I was making notes, and there's lots of things I want to get to. So no, I think you're right. If anyone has things they want us to chat about, or if they have suggestions or something, I think that would be really helpful. But look, at the very least, if no one watches, you and I are just going to have some good conversations.
Yeah, we're gonna have it. We're gonna be talking no matter what. We figured we'll just start filming it, but we do enjoy. Hopefully, this does become a broader conversation as Jeff and I go around. I know there's a lot of folks who are looking at these topics, and it kind of falls within this kind of sometimes gray area, right? Because it's not so much of what we're talking about is that gray area that is not really clear. Is this about leadership? Is about being innovative? Is about culture? Is about change? What is this? But it's that connective tissue that I think make great leaders great, no matter what your role is. It doesn't even have to be about being a CEO. So yeah, I'm looking forward to exploring it. Jeff, it's always great to be talking, and I'm going to keep having my free Dragon Army coffee here for the rest of the morning. Thanks, everybody. Keep following us on our various social media platforms, and we look forward to talking to you again very soon.